want to talk just briefly about the newspaper's work on human trafficking. So 2 years ago, we decided that this was going to be the focus of our editorial page. We have 3 areas of engagement: civic engagement, teaching children in poverty, and of course, human trafficking. I joined the paper 2 years ago, and this was an issue that I knew about before I joined here, and I knew a lot of the facts about it, and I brought it to the paper and said, this is something we need to be care a lot about. And as we dug into it, it's an issue, if you know anything about it, the more you dig into it, the more shocking it becomes. So delighted to know that the paper dug deep into it and that our community is deeply engaged in it. I'm going to also say it's an exciting time to be involved in this issue, because although that human trafficking is a scourge here in Texas, Texas is also leading on the response to it. So particularly here in Dallas, you see a lot of nonprofits, and also everyone on the stage here deeply engaged in pushing and finding new ways to push against this problem. So the problem is here, but the solution's also here, and we're finding ways to make progress on it. I want to just mention quickly what trafficking is, because I think sometimes it gets a little confused. People think trafficking, it has to mean physically traveling from one place to another, particularly over an international border. It often involves that, but it doesn't have to. Trafficking is when a person is under someone else's control. There's people on the stage that'll give me a more legal definition of it, but essentially it boils down to someone under someone else's control and being exploited is how I speak about it. And then I do want to say, before we dip into it, just on a personal level, that something that I've been able to do in my seat is get to know a lot of people that have come out of the life of being trafficked. And I'll just say, it can affect anybody from any walk of life. It's not just someone from the other side of the tracks, not from someone, hey, that's not me. No, it often can be your neighbor, your daughter, someone you know very personally. So it can touch many more people, and it does touch many more people than those people realize. So with that, Victor, I actually want to start with you. You're someone who could have taken your career in many different directions, but yet you dove deep into this. We heard a little bit on your bio here at the beginning. I wonder if you could just tell us very quickly what sparked your passion for this issue. Why did you delve deep into this? And then I want to ask, as you do that, maybe tell us a little bit about the arc of this issue. Start maybe in the 90s and take us through today. The world has changed with trafficking. If you could give us some of the milestones and legislative and executive changes that have helped shape this fight over the last 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I just want to thank you all for coming. I think one of the shifts that's happened is that we are actually able to have a room of this size come and talk about this issue. 20 years ago, when I first learned about this issue, that was not the case. My first exposure to human trafficking came when I was actually a student at Harvard, began traveling the developing world, and learned about a particular case involving a 12-year-old girl who lived in rural India, whose family sent her to a big city to earn some money. She gets a job in a restaurant, basically washing dishes, earns her summer money, is getting ready to head back home to her family. And to do that, she's got to catch a train from Victoria Station in Mumbai back to her village. Well, that's just an incredibly busy, chaotic station. She's having trouble finding her train. 2 older women approach her, offer to help. They get on the train together, they start chatting, they have some tea, and it turns out the tea is drugged. And so she is knocked out cold, and when she wakes up, she finds herself on the 3rd floor of a brothel in the red light district of Mumbai, where these 2 women have sold her for what we now know is the equivalent of $250 American. So from that point forward, that becomes her life. At the age of 12, I've got a 12-year-old daughter now myself. It's just horrific. At the age of 12, she's forced to meet her quota. She's got to service 7 to 12 men a day, 7 days a week. And as I learned about her story, it just makes your blood boil. You think, how do you do this to a 12-year-old? And over time, I discovered that her story was not an anomaly, but it's replicated on a large scale around the globe. And ultimately had this sort of sense that this is what I'm supposed to do. And it just never went away. And ultimately changed the course of my life. I left, I was in a graduate program at Oxford, and then left to go to law school to be equipped with the gifts that I thought I would need to be effective in this space. And it's interesting to see how the landscape has shifted since that time. So in the late 90s, trafficking was virtually on nobody's radar. It's barely on the periphery. Following the end of the Cold War, you started to have a few stories coming out about concerns about transnational crime, particularly with former Soviet states and victims being transported by transnational rings focused on sex trafficking and prostitution. And those stories kind of perked out. You started having some faith-based communities that started seeing trafficking as they were in the developing world, particularly looking at other things. And you had some human rights activists that started seeing this. And over time, there became this kind of shocking coalition that included sort of the secular feminist left and sort of the conservative evangelical right, who might not agree on much, but on this, they agreed. And it drove ultimately a new piece of legislation, which we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of this year, and that's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And that was really the first comprehensive anti-trafficking legislation to exist in the United States. And it's the statute that I used when I was a prosecutor for almost a decade with the Justice Department. It's the statute that our colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's Office mostly use when they're working trafficking cases. And it did a couple of really key things. One is it created some new tools for prosecutors to go after traffickers that allow them to go after traffickers the way the traffickers actually operate. The old anti-slavery laws became so narrowly construed by the Supreme Court that they really weren't that useful for prosecutors. The other big thing it did is it created a new office within the State Department that was required to assign a grade to every country in the world on how well they were combating trafficking. And if you got a failing grade, you were subject to economic sanctions from the U.S. So what we realized is if you're serious about bridging this gap between slavery and freedom, you've really got to have three things. You've got to have laws, which are kind of the authority to enforce. You have to have political will, which is the incentive to enforce. And then you got to have enforcement capacity, which is really the ability to enforce. And there's been a shocking transformation in just the last 20 years in the legislative landscape. So not only did the U.S. government pass this anti-trafficking law, but at the same time in 2000, the United Nations put together a protocol that essentially created a model law and put pressure on governments around the world to also pass anti-trafficking legislation. And now over 160 countries in the world have anti-trafficking legislation. 20 years ago, a small handful of countries had it. Today, almost every country in the world has it. So legislation is really not the main problem anymore. Well, then it was like, well, there's laws in the books, but who cares if there's no political will to actually enforce them? I remember the early days being in India and feeling like I could walk into a police station in India with undercover video of an underage girl, a 12-year-old girl being offered for commercial sex, and they'd kind of look at you as if you went into the Dallas Police Department with video of Erin going 40 to 35. Like, well, yeah, it's a technical violation, but who cares? I got more important things to do. And for a while, I felt like until you solve that political will problem, and for a while, I felt like until there's a cultural transformation or moral transformation, we're just not going to make any progress. But one of the amazing social transformations that occurred, this is another big milestone, is creating self-interested reasons for governments to care about improving enforcement. One was the State Department sanctions. Countries now realize, wow, if this 12-year-old girl stays in a brothel, if I'm a high-level politician in India, it actually affected my economic relationship with the United States. So they start shutting down the chain of command to their police and prosecutors and judges. You guys got to get this fixed, because this is now a problem for me. No moral transformation, no epiphany about the value of women, but just in their own economic self-interest, they start to see traffickers as a roadblock, standing between them and the economic objectives that they care about. Well, now they're shutting down the chain of command to these police and prosecutors and judges to get this fixed, but the question is, do they have the actual ability to do it? And that's the third big innovation, is enforcement capacity. And that was a challenge here in the U.S. when I started at the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, which was the first specialized unit of federal prosecutors that would focus exclusively on human trafficking cases on a national level. And early on, I would find FBI agents and prosecutors who seemed to think trafficking was a pretty compelling type of case to work on, but they didn't know how to get started. And they didn't have someone down the hall that they could ask. And so these cases just weren't happening. And so now we've seen, this is like the last, I think, big innovation that we've seen, is the creation of specialized units. We have narcotics units and homicide units and organized crime units to address specialized areas of crime. When I was in the Justice Department, we piloted a new kind of specialized unit. We went to 6 different districts around the country, and basically would create small units of police and prosecutors that would focus on human trafficking, victim specialists that would support the work. And then we would pair them up with me or another prosecutor in our national unit and just start working cases together. And within 2 years, those 6 pilot districts had produced more convictions than the other 88 federal districts combined. And we realized, wow, it's not rocket science. It's just, that's how you build specialized skills. That model is now spreading in the US, but where it's not yet spreading is in the developing world, where 93% of the world's victims reside. And honestly, that's why we created the Human Trafficking Institute, to take that model that was successfully piloted in the US, to develop in countries that are motivated to improve enforcement, but don't have access to the model or the expertise to do it.
Thanks. Erin, I want to turn to you. I think in you we have a prosecutor that not only has the will, but the know-how to do it. But I think anyone who dips into this issue, you quickly find that it involves federal prosecutors, local police departments. It becomes a sort of alphabet soup of different agencies involved in it. I was wondering if you couldn't help us understand that a little bit more clearly, and why does it take all those different types of agencies, whether federal, state, local, involved in it? I wonder if you could also, in your answer, tell us a little bit how prevalent is this in Texas and North Texas, and if you have particular examples. I think that's always helpful for people to get a sense of it.
Sure, and thank you so much for having us. I mean, the Dallas Morning News over the last couple of years has been a really strong voice in educating the public about human trafficking, and we really thank you for that. So in terms of a lot of the different agencies working on it, I mean, we have now, and since I became U.S. Attorney, there certainly hasn't been a lack of law enforcement that views it as a problem and wants to understand how to deal with it effectively. I think the larger issue for law enforcement right now is twofold. Number one, as you said, there's a lot of alphabet soup agencies going in a lot of different directions, and I think the best thing that we can do, and as a U.S. Attorney's Office, this is something that we can do to facilitate leadership in this area, is bringing a lot of these entities together and organizing them in a way where we can be more effective together. So in this district, we have the North Texas Human Trafficking Task Force. It is a coalition of all of these alphabet soup agencies, so HSI, FBI, we have the Department of Labor involved, we have certainly the AG's offices involved, and we have many of the local police departments that are operating in this space. And some of these agencies are co-located. They're all about working on law enforcement answers, and they're in a pretty good position to deconflict the cases and to understand which cases can be presented for federal prosecution and which cases can be presented for state prosecution. And that's a really great place for us to be in. Texas is one of the states where we have really great laws on the books against human trafficking, good penalties on the books against human trafficking, so it's a matter of seeing who can best address the cases. So we're participating in that pretty heavily, helping to organize that. I have a prosecutor in my office, she's here tonight, who's our human trafficking coordinator. We have our entire violent crime section is dedicated to sort of taking on as many cases as we possibly can. And so I think we're all trying to figure out how to deal with it. I think the second problem from a law enforcement perspective is really getting the victims to identify as victims. I think human trafficking victims, we do not have as much outcry as we would want. We tend to explore whether it's sex trafficking or forced labor cases. We have a very difficult time getting victims to identify themselves as victims and to want to work with law enforcement to prosecute their traffickers. And it doesn't really matter. You think this is so simple. You have a young child who's clearly being trafficked, but oftentimes the traffickers are taking advantage of runaways, those that are out of in the foster system, those that are disenfranchised, vulnerable victims that they're taking advantage to, and this is the person who's taking care of them. So taking them out of that codependent violent cycle is very, very hard, and it takes a long time, and it's a unique skill set, and we work a lot with victim specialists to help us understand how to best work with those. They are witnesses in our cases. We absolutely have to have their cooperation to make our cases. So, and in the forced labor case, especially when we have foreigners that are trafficked and in labor situations in the United States, they believe that their situation here is much better than where they came from many times. or they don't know they have rights that they have in the United States. They're being told by their traffickers, this is what you have, and if you raise your hand, you're going to be deported. If you raise your hand, you're going to be put in jail. And so that's the intimidation and coercion that happens, where they oftentimes are not, they're not chained in the house. They're allowed to walk freely, but they really do not understand that they're victims and identify as victims. And so some of the really good thing that is happening is some of the awareness about trying to get victims to understand, to work with law enforcement, and also trying to get other people around them in the community to raise their hand and say, I think these people are being trafficked, and help law enforcement in that way.
Absolutely. You just heard the U.S. Attorney tell us a very complex piece about this fight, which is often the victims themselves don't present as victims. And so it gets, I think, confusing to some folks, but it makes it much more complex. Mr. General, I wanted to, actually, I hope it's okay if I call you Ken.
Perfect.
Stage. We feel like we're going to fight together.
That's what most people call me.
I was excited that you had the opportunity to come here tonight, because you're someone who immediately understood the importance of this issue, and upon taking office, you took action. You set up a task force that aggressively went after this issue. And by the way, I wanted to mention to the audience, if you haven't had a chance, you should go to the Attorney General's website and look. There's an extremely powerful video on there about how you can be a person who stands up and be the one that speaks out, and you might be the person that saves someone's life. It's an hour-long video, but it's worth watching every minute of it. But I wanted to ask you, one, if you could tell us a little bit more about the task force you stood up and how successful it's been, and what has it done?
So first of all, thank you for hosting this. It's obviously a huge issue in this country and really internationally. And Texas is the second worst state in the country for human trafficking. Houston's the worst city. And I would like to say, I'm really sorry that Erin couldn't get into Baylor. She had to go to Texas. But you think
Nice.
so? You feel a little bad for her. So I knew nothing about human trafficking until 2013. It was my first session in the Texas Senate. And Letitia Van de Putte, a Democrat senator from San Antonio, had a human trafficking bill in front of one of my committees. And I sat there and listened for hours, these really horrific stories about what was happening in our state to so many young women, and particularly, and I don't know if it was because I have 3 daughters that it affected me so much, but when the testimony finished, I went up to Letitia and I said, do you have help from any Republicans yet? And she said, no. And I said, well, sign me up. And I became very interested in the issue and did everything I could to help her and what we could, trying to get more good legislation passed in the Senate. But I promised myself if I had any other opportunities in the future, I'd do something about it. So my first year in office, 2015, it took us about a year of time. We didn't have any money from the legislature that was particularly designated for human trafficking. But I decided we were going to find a way to do this. And so we put together our first human trafficking unit with 3 prosecutors, several investigators, somebody that helped victims. And it took us about a year, but we kicked it off after my first year, and we were on our way. And we decided we were going to start big. And so we focused on what we thought was the largest online purveyor of prostitution and trafficking in the world. And the reason we thought that is 73% of the calls to the Center for Missing and Exploited Children came as it related to Backpage.com. And they were right here in our backyard in Dallas. And so we joined forces with DOJ and with the FBI and with California, and we did our investigation. We ended up arresting the CEO, and he ended up in federal prison, and we ended up shutting Backpage.com down. And so that was in our first 8 months. And we really wanted to send the message that we're serious about this. If you're here and we know about you, with whatever resources we have, we're going to go after you. And so that was our start. We've done many other prosecutions since then, but the reality is, as Mark Penley, Mark, raise your hand, he's head of my criminal division. He came from DOJ doing terrorism, and now he's over that part of our office of human trafficking. And one of the things we struggle with is just the lack of resources that we have, and there's so much going on. In 2016, I think there were a total of, in the counties, about 250 prosecutions. It's not a lot of prosecutions when you realize how many thousands of cases are going on right at our noses. So we really focused on that, but we've also focused on education, which I'm happy to talk about, and also partnering with as many other groups as we can, whether it's what you talked about with other agencies, federal, local, we don't care. we know we can't stop it alone, and that we need all the help we can get from anybody that cares about this issue we want to work with.
You mentioned Backpage. I'm not sure if everyone absorbs how important of a fight that was. I mean, you talk about basically a Craigslist where human beings are sold openly here in the United States, and they had offices here in Dallas. By the way, there's now an anti-trafficking group that occupies that space.
That is very rewarding to me, by the way. The Deliver Fund is now there, which we had met with before we shut down Backpage.com.
Yeah, it's striking just how much out in the open. And Deliver Fund talks about one of the things that they look at. They go through someone's Facebook page and they see a guy there advertising girls holding a bag full of cash, and he says the bag full of cash is usually to tell to show that this is a problem. So a lot of this happens out in the open. I mean, that's what's just sort of striking to me, that this is just happening. You could drive down the street and point it out. People can see what's going on. I mean, was that striking to you, that it's just how much of it's out in the open?
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is most people don't think about it. They just don't pay attention. They're not aware of the warning signs. And so, it's happening right in front of us every day, and we don't know what to look for. And so part of what we've tried to do is we've tried to educate people. And we put out this video that he mentioned called Be the One. And if you watch it, it's on our website, or we'll send it to you. It's not a typical boring government video. And I think you would agree with that. And it really just goes through and talks about normal people that just happen to pay attention and that reported it. And I'll give you 2 examples in the video. One was a guy just noticed that this house across the street, and he was in the Woodlands, a very affluent area, and this house just kept having traffic, although it seemed like nobody lived there. So he videotaped it, just constant traffic coming into this house, and it turned out he ended up reporting it and shut down a major human trafficking ring in that area. Another woman, really amazing, she just noticed this girl would come out of the house, just occasionally to empty the trash, and she just thought it was strange. And so one day she just decided to go over and introduce herself. She said, "Hey, do you need help?" And she said, "Yes, I do." And she told her that, basically she was being held against her will. And this young woman who was rescued now heads up an anti-human trafficking organization in Dallas. So it's amazing what one little step of just paying attention and stepping forward and being aware can do.
Well, I want to ask, so what else can be done? I mean, Victor, you mentioned that there's, a lot of the legislative landscape has changed, but is there legislation, or is there executive actions, or are there other things that can be passed that can be helpful? I'm thinking, I guess, recently Governor Abbott changed or made a provision to trafficking victims can now seek clemency in a different way, and potentially getting clemency. Are there other changes that we should be looking at? I mean, actually ask this of all the panelists, that we should be looking at and thinking about that could be done that could help make a difference.
In my view, the core pieces are actually in place. Like, there are certain tweaks that would be helpful in the margins, but I think the primary thing that trafficking victims today need most is not new legislation. It's enforcement of existing legislation. And so the kind of legislation that I think is most useful is resource investment and concentrating resources in the places that are working. So experiments like the specialized unit pilot that we talked about before, do those experiments and scale up what's working. Make the investments to scale what's working. And 10, 15 years ago, we just didn't know what would work. Now we're starting to see some clues. We're starting to see some experiments that are working. And I think larger investments in what's working is where you're going to see the biggest impact in reducing the actual number of traffickers and therefore the number of trafficking victims.
So, in terms of legislation, I think we're well equipped at the federal level. I know there was an effort at the state level. You can probably speak to it better than I about the AG's office having jurisdiction to prosecute human trafficking cases all across the state. Certainly I think more people paying attention to this problem and having more jurisdiction over this problem is a good thing. But I agree that what we need to do is focus on enforcement efforts. And also, what I really like to think about is how can we attack cases in a different way using different tools. We certainly have human trafficking statutes to use, but recently, our office has prosecuted brothels and human traffickers under the racketeering statute. And we have cases that we're looking at different websites and web platforms for a whole host of charges that don't necessarily fall under the the rubric of human trafficking, but is getting at the human trafficking problem. So I think we need to have more law enforcement resources and to look at it creatively in terms of how we get at the root of the problem.
Yeah, so Erin mentioned we did try to pass legislation that did not pass, that was designed to give us jurisdiction over human trafficking cases. We did not get that. We're very close to getting it. So we've really focused in the interim, at least, in trying to cooperate more with local district attorneys, because we have the talent at the state level. We built a team that does just human trafficking, which is unusual. Most of these local jurisdictions don't have that kind of talent or the ability to get it, but we have it, and so we're trying to work with DAs and other law enforcement people to refer those cases to us so that we can do that. And I know Mark has spent a lot of time in his few months in our office trying to develop more cooperation, because we are putting more resources into this. There is more money going to it. The legislature's put more money into it. The federal government's putting more money into it. Local jurisdictions are putting more effort into it. And part of the problem we have is coordination. And I think that's one of the things we're really trying to focus on in our office is let's coordinate better, because we can leverage our resources better if we're working together instead of everybody's kind of doing their own thing. So our effort is to work more with Erin's office, to work with private organizations, and to work with local DAs.
Let's talk a little bit about those prosecutions. But my sense of it is so let's step back here. I met with some folks from the International Justice Mission, which was mentioned earlier. And one of the things that they pointed out is that one, this is a crime that can be pushed back, right? It's a discretionary purchase, is the way they described it, and you can give people an incentive not to do it. But one thing that has come out in our reporting is that it's important to, one, go after the traffickers, two, win the cooperation of the women, and three, show there's a future outside of it. So if you leave this world, if you are a witness in a case and find a way out, you'll have a future if you do it. Is that your experience, and is it important to focus on going after the traffickers? Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I think what we try to do is identify the traffickers, and certainly in my office we try to target criminal enterprises, traffickers that are utilizing human trafficking as a criminal enterprise, and how that criminal enterprise is being facilitated. So a lot of times it's helpful for us to trace the money and use our money laundering statutes to address it. But really try and get at more of these organized efforts to make the biggest impact that we can make. I also think it's really interesting, and I agree with Victor, that there has been a bit of a paradigm shift, because I'd say even as little as 2 years ago when I took office, there was still a debate amongst DA's offices and police departments as to what was prostitution versus what was human trafficking. And the inability, I think, to understand that some of the juveniles that were coming in off of prostitution, charges or solicitation charges, they weren't being really funneled to the right resources, the victim resources that could really help them. And even the adults that were coming in with multiple prostitution charges, there wasn't an effort to look behind that curtain and see how is this being organized and take it out, at the organizational level. So I think in the last 2 years we have made a lot of progress in that. Just different vernacular and changing the paradigm, certainly. And then, having law enforcement really treat it in a different way. I think we've been successful there. There's obviously a lot more we can do, but that's been a pivotal change, in my opinion.
I think that's one thing that's surprising to people is that how large these criminal enterprises are. It's
Right.
not just one person in this particular house. The case you mentioned, the Woodlands Trish Hallway in New York, if my memory serves, is that something that you find as well, that if you follow the money, if you follow to a larger organization, you actually find that the cancer is much larger than one node?
Yeah, and that's why I think it's so important we work together, because these people don't often stay in the same place. They can move. And so, if you just have one local jurisdiction working on it, a lot of times you can't track them like you need to. And that's why I think it's so critical that we start getting in our heads that this isn't just, a problem that can be solved just locally or just at the state level or just at the federal level. It doesn't matter who gets the credit for this. We need to figure out a way to work together to end this. And, we had a horrible scourge, with human slavery in our country. We found a way to end it. We need to find a way to end this.
Absolutely. I've heard described the next front in this fight is at the business level, that we're seeing airlines now give training to employees, we're seeing hotels as well. Is that a piece that comes across your desk? Is that a piece that you think is an important next step?
I do. I think it's really important. We've seen several organizations step up, and part of our outreach effort is obviously to talk to these organizations. I mean, there are certain sectors that are obvious entities we need to be doing outreach to, and Homeland Security actually has a whole blue campaign about talking to these sectors, hospitality sectors, and that. But you see companies coming out, airlines coming out. Walmart, for example, has the Trucking Against Traffickers effort that they have, that they really supported, and really speaking to, what can they be doing to both promote awareness of it and help stop it. The flip side of that is we need to be critical about companies that are aware of it and aren't doing anything. And there's certainly civil statutes on the federal books that we can do something with those, and we certainly need to be looking at corporations who are turning a blind eye to it, and who are in a good position to do something about it, and how we're going to be working with them to, if necessary, prosecute them. I think those are definitely options on the books, and there are some offenders out there that really need to be looked at in a close way.
Victor, you had a point to make?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that there's a couple of different pieces that corporations can do that are really meaningful. One is just the training of organizations and companies to look for markers of trafficking and help build the referral network. One of the things that's unique about trafficking that's different from a lot of other crimes is that most of the time victims don't self-identify. So if there's a bank robbery, someone calls 911 and says, hey, I was a victim of a crime, and the FBI comes out, it's a responsive crime. But in trafficking, you have this tragic, almost this tragic, you have the trafficker who's deliberately trying to hide it from view, and you often have this victim that also doesn't want you to see what's happened because they feel so embarrassed and ashamed often of what's happened, even though it's not their fault. That's the experience that they have. And so developing proactive investigative tools is really key. And that often involves people beyond law enforcement, people who are clued into different clues that can come about and can help build that referral network. The other thing that we've seen on a global scale is that with the rise of globalization, more and more multinational corporations have gone to emerging markets to find a large pool of low-skilled labor and emerging middle class of consumers that can buy their stuff. And now they can get in a lot of trouble, as Erin alluded to, if there's trafficking in their supply chains. Not just their own employees or contractors, but also their subcontractors and subs of subs, and they're concerned about that. Well, large governments in the developing world are now internalizing that, and they're realizing, wait a second, if we can measurably decimate trafficking within our borders, then we've got a competitive advantage versus peer countries and be able to recruit and retain that private sector investment. And that becomes another driver of political will to say, hey, we gotta actually increase enforcement because it impacts our bottom line.
Ken, I wanted to ask you in particular, we're obviously a pretty business-friendly state, a growing state, a lot of jobs coming here, Uber's coming here, trucking companies are traversing the state. Is this an issue you see that private industry is helpful and can be helpful, and also potentially part of the problem that needs to be looked at?
Yeah, it's interesting you use Uber. Uber is one of those companies that's now very engaged in human trafficking and trying to train their drivers because they're in a position to see, what's going on all night, every day. And so I think there are some companies, they came to us and said, hey, we want to be a part of the solution. So I think, at least I'm finding more and more companies that there are also, issues with some of the social media companies as we deal with encryption and it makes it much more difficult for law enforcement to track this and makes it much more sort of confidential and harder to track. And so I think we're going to have to struggle with some of these issues as it relates to privacy versus law enforcement and being able to protect these young women from being trafficked.
I want to talk, we hinted at this, Erin mentioned using money laundering statutes and other things to go after, but I wanted to ask, how does this crime intersect with other crimes we think about? I think about particular drugs and the porn industry. Are there particular industries and particularly other areas of crime that we think about that have a large intersection or overlap with this crime?
Well, we see it oftentimes in gang activity, and we see it in drug activity. I mean, when we take down, a large drug organization that's operating out of a hotel here in Dallas, it takes down a whole swath of human trafficking as well. And, I mean, we view human trafficking as a violent crime, no different than gangs or drug dealing or guns, and so that's why we have it in our violent crime section, and we think about the intersection of those areas. I mean, one of our bigger cases this past year resulted from a drug investigation, gang investigation, where just by happenstance, we got involved with a woman who was, willing to allow the undercover agents to order up women for purposes of businessmen coming into town for an alleged event. And so it resulted in a very large undercover operation, taking down a woman who was running 2 brothels, but also had the ability to just dial up women to come into town to participate in this. And in those cases, we went after the money, and we went after the people that were sort of forming the enterprise that allowed that to happen. But that's a really surprising thing when you just happen onto one of these organizations, and then you're able to take down a pretty large organization.
It metastasizes.
It really does. Yeah, exactly.
One thing that I hear anti-trafficking advocates talk to me about a lot is just how much traffickers will use drugs to either get women addicted, maybe use it as a way to keep them involved in the work. And some of them refer to it as a leash, heroin as a leash. If they're addicted, they'll be more compliant because they're looking for that drug. Is that common widespread for this issue, or is that just something anecdotal I'm hearing a lot of? Is that something you see throughout when you're making these busts and when you're breaking up these rooms?
No, I think that's common sense would tell you that is an effective way to keep these women tied to the people that are making money off them. So yeah, it's definitely a problem, and it's a challenging problem, because how do we stop that from happening, and how do we stop this sort of addiction problem that keeps them in human trafficking? It really is a fundamental issue with the whole human trafficking issue.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. Go ahead. I do think that there's a interesting intersection with opioid addiction that we have. We see overdose deaths, and we see human trafficking. There's a nexus there that we wish we had more visibility to. So when we have, drug dealers dealing heroin, dealing opioids, oftentimes you'll see the result, heroin users coming in and being victimized in that way. So I think, we're trying to tackle both issues, and we're seeing a, overlay of both of them.
I'll just add, I think that's one of that model of coercion highlights one of the advantages of the TVPA, the law that was passed 20 years ago to give prosecutors new tools that we couldn't go after. There was a landmark case that one of my colleagues at the Justice Department did in Florida, where that was the sole method of coercion. There's literally, you do the search warrant, you find this guy who's got, in his house, he's literally got pharmacology books. And he's put together a cocktail of drugs that he will give to some victims who are not addicted. But after about 4 hours, if you don't get that cocktail, you feel like you're about to die. And so he didn't have to have physical chains. He didn't have to threaten them. He didn't have to hit them or beat them. Literally, there's just this tragic image where one of the victims is just retching over the toilet, and he's just standing there at the bathroom door, kind of waving the pills, going, "You ready to work?" And he had created a chemical tether. And if you think about it from the trafficker's perspective, they're in it to make money. And so it's a lot of effort to hold a gun to someone's head 24/7. It's a lot of resources investment.
Yeah.
Well, if you use a chemical tether, then you know that wherever they go, they're going to have to come back to you in 4 hours, and that's a lot cheaper resource investment on their end, so they make more money. So these are the kinds of clever, coercive tactics that traffickers are using that until this law came into existence, we could not go after that case. But now we can, and that was actually upheld on appeal.
You mentioned how much money is involved in this. I think that's something that I think shocks a lot of folks. That law enforcement officers say that human trafficking is more profitable or more lucrative than drugs, because every drug that you sell, you have to import that much, or whatever human beings you can sell over and over again. Can you give us a sense of just how lucrative this is for the traffickers? I mean, how much money are we talking about?
Yeah, traffickers, according to the International Labor Organization, this year will bring in about $150 billion in profits, not revenue, actual profits. So to put that into context, if traffickers were incorporated, they would this year outperform Apple and Microsoft, Samsung, BP, and Exxon combined. So globally, it's a massive moneymaker, and in part for the reason that you just suggested. If you're thinking about organized crime, if you're selling guns or drugs, that's a depleting resource. So once I sell my inventory of guns or drugs to you, I've got to go to a supplier to get more. That's a very risky transaction for me. I could get robbed, I could get arrested, it could be a sting operation, I could get killed. In trafficking, I'm the scary person in that transaction. If I'm the trafficker, I'm acquiring a young girl. She's afraid of me, I'm not afraid of her, and then who am I selling them to? I'm selling them to Johns who just kind of want to do their business and skulk off in the night. They don't want to meet me, they're afraid of me. Mm-hmm. And I could sell that girl over and over and over again without ever having to replenish my inventory. And it's just sick to talk about it in these cold economic terms, but as I've sat across from traffickers for a decade doing these cases, that is how they think about it. This is an economic crime for them, and they're in it to make money.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and also one thing that I've tried to do in the last couple of years, and I think we've been somewhat successful, is getting restitution in our human trafficking cases. I think the feds have a poor track record of this, and I don't think it's for lack of knowledge that it's possible or trying. I think just the way that restitution happens in the federal system doesn't allow for accurate reporting, and the people you need information from are the victims who may or may not want to sort of respond. They won't respond to the typical letter about the damages to them, and probation may or may not be able to find them. And so we've tried to be better about keeping the victims close so that we can seek restitution. We've had some successes in the forced labor case that we prosecuted last year in Fort Worth. We had $288,000 worth of restitution ordered. In a case this year, we had $333,000 worth of restitution ordered. But we're going to try and make sure that we get the restitution ordered if we can, in every case that we can, because I think that that's a really important part of it.
Well, I was just going to say, just the fact that it's continuing to grow almost in every state, despite the resources that we're all putting into it, I think common sense tells you there's a lot of profit involved in human trafficking.
Can you tell us a little bit about who is buying? Well, first off, who are these women that are forced into it? And usually women, but not always. And then who's buying it? Who are the Johns? Is it who are the clients?
I don't know if there's any real. You've got parents selling their kids into human trafficking. It cuts across all economic lines, all social lines, all ethnic lines, and the same I think is true on the buy side. It's a prevalent issue across our society, and there's no, I think at this point, no pegging it to a certain group.
Yeah, and I think that, for the first time, I think you hear people from the Department of Justice talking about demand reduction, which is something that we really ought to take a hard look at, how we can be a partner on demand reduction. I think here locally, we've worked with DPS, and they're one of the state agencies that have, done a lot in this area on working on that side of the case. I absolutely think that you can't go after one side of the case and expect to have success.
I'll just add, one of the things that was always a challenge when I was at DOJ is that we just didn't have the data to answer some of those questions. And after I left, when we started the Human Trafficking Institute, we tried to set out to solve that problem. So we now, every year, put out a report called the Federal Human Trafficking Report that's a comprehensive look at literally every single federal case in the country to draw out insights about trends in trafficking, the demographic picture of traffickers and victims, looking at what districts are the highest performers, what are the lowest performers. And I just want to compliment Erin and her team because actually out on the table outside, we have put together these state reports that give you a picture by state of how your state's doing. And you can pick those up outside on the table. And Texas, the Northern District of Texas is doing very strong. They're actually first in new criminal cases, first in active criminal cases, and first in convictions nationwide. So I just want to commend Erin and her team on the work that
really talented team, and a lot of people care about it, both at the feds and state level, and so I think it's something that we're all trying to work really hard on.
I want to ask, obviously Texas, we're a border state, and I think a lot of people think of this as a foreign issue where women are trafficked into the country. What I've found is not reporting that it's a mix. There's plenty of kids recruited or forced out of the foster system, or a trafficker finds someone who's either an emotional point or exploitable and pulls them into this. You don't necessarily have to be someone who's a foreign national. Is that your experience, or can you give us a sense of that?
Yeah, in fact, the best data we have, even on a global scale, is that 3/4 of victims never cross the border of any kind. And so part of the challenge is that even the term trafficking, it sounds like it's about movement. It sounds like you're moving someone, but really, as you pointed out at the beginning, it's really about coercion. It's about using threats or violence to coerce someone into commercial sex or into labor. And if you're a trafficker, you're looking for the easiest, least restrictive, least risky way to do it. So if I can go down to the local bus station and find a runaway, or as one trafficker told me, I'm not looking for runaways, I'm looking for throwaways. If you can find someone like that, why in the world would I undertake all the risk of going across state lines or going across country lines to move them if I don't have to? It's just an extra element of risk that traffickers don't take. And that's one of the big shifts that we've seen in modern trafficking versus, say, the transatlantic slave trade, where there was this systematic movement of one group of people all across the country. And even then, it was a huge cost to the slave traders because they would lose cargo. People would die on the slave ships, and it would be an economic loss. And so traffickers have wised up and have come up with more efficient ways to commit the crime that often don't involve moving across borders. Well, I just want to say, I think this is actually an incredibly exciting time to be a part of this movement. You know, when I grew up, I was reading, this children's biography of Abe Lincoln and this epic battle against slavery that my kids are now reading. And then I got a little older and thought, oh, this is part of a bygone era. It just doesn't exist anymore. That era of great moral struggle, it's relegated to the history books. And it wasn't until, like I said, 20 years ago that I discovered that's really not true. It actually exists, and it exists on an epic scale. And when you think about it, over the course of history, slavery has flourished for literally thousands of years. It's just in the last couple hundred years that it's even been illegal in most countries. Now, in the last 20 years, it's become illegal in almost every country in the world for the first time in history. Now there's economic incentives for governments to care about improving enforcement, even if it's for their own self-interest. And now we've built out models that develop the specialized skills to go out and find it and stop the traffickers. And what I discovered, this is kind of the game changer for me, was you don't need to prosecute that many traffickers. You just get a critical mass of traffickers, and all of a sudden you get a lot of other traffickers going, it's too risky, I'm out. And to me, that's the game changer. We talk about, in our organization, we don't talk about ending trafficking, we talk about decimating it. And decimate means literally to cut by 10%. In ancient Rome, there was a practice where they would try to keep these army units from defecting by saying, hey, if you defect and we catch you, we'll decimate your unit, which meant we would randomly execute 10% of you. It created widespread compliance. So now we talk about decimation as having this universalizing effect. I think the analogy is that if we get that critical mass, if you get those 10% of traffickers, other traffickers don't know where the risk is going to fall. And all of a sudden, it gets too risky and starts to these big drops in the prevalence of trafficking. So I think this is an incredibly exciting time to see trafficking decimated for the first time in history on a wide scale, and we get to have a front row seat to seeing that happen. That's what I was dreaming about as a kid, that I could be a part of that fight, and now we all get to be a part of that fight. And I think it's the stewardship of that tangible hope that is missing. I think most people today, they hear trafficking and they want to back away. Because they hear a story like the story I shared about the 12-year-old girl, they think, I want to do something. We've got to stop that now. But you start to hear big numbers, 25 million victims, $150 billion in profits, and you start to sink in your soul. And you think, oh, I can't draw near to this. It's like a fire that's too big to put out. I'm going to get burned. I got to back away. And if we do, we will miss it. We will miss it. Because we are now on the cusp of seeing this widespread trafficking fall. Don't miss it. We get to actually be a part of that together.
So what I would want to conclude with is, just from my perspective, and I commend to you the Human Trafficking Institute's report. It is a great report, and thank you for the kudos to our district. But as good as we look in that report, we are self-critical about what we're doing and that we're not doing enough. We need to be doing more, and we are organizing around that principle to push law enforcement to come together, to encourage them to make cases, bigger cases, higher impact cases, and to tell them that we are going to be their partner in it every single step of the way. And I think, if we can all come together, whether it's U.S. attorneys, there's 4 in Texas, or the DAs that we have all across the districts and the AG's office, if we can all come together with that principle, I think that we could make a really big impact. I know everyone has talented teams. I certainly have a talented team that's motivated, charged up to do these kind of cases. And these cases are incredibly difficult. They are challenging because of the victims, like we talked about before, but they are emotional. They are horrible cases for the prosecutors to work on and to put on before the court, and they're fraught with a lot of issues. And a lot of these cases do go to trial. These traffickers, the penalties are so high. One of the traffickers last year, it was a life sentence. The penalties are so high that there is not an incentive for them to not just roll the dice and go to trial. So we go to trial quite often on these cases. So we have to make sure that we're making really great cases. And so, I really applaud being here and having this organizing principle, and I hope that everyone in the audience becomes an ambassador for the issue of working on human trafficking as a group and as a community, because we all need to make referrals to law enforcement, encourage victims to get the outreach, and we have some really incredible nonprofits operating in this community that have wraparound services for human trafficking victims and really, really want to help them get their lives back in order, and I'm proud to be able to work with some of those as well.
So human slavery in this country was still profitable when it was ending. So human trafficking is the same way. It's going to continue to be profitable economically, and it didn't end because it wasn't profitable. It ended because the horrible consequences to the people that were in it, those stories started being told and people started caring about it. There was a will to end it. Not by everybody. We're never going to have that even on human trafficking. But the more we can educate people, the more that they can see the stories, just like me. When I heard the stories, I was horrified. And so many people just don't know the impact of human trafficking on the lives of these particularly young women. And so I think the more we can do to educate people, I totally agree that prosecution matters, but in the end, it's the will to change this by enough people, and we will change it. And I really hope, Victor talked about reading about history and how, wasn't it amazing that at least sometime in our country, these people were part of stopping this. I really hope that me and you, will be part of the history books. We'll be part of being alive when human trafficking comes to an end in this country and in this world.